Okay, well, it's not at the beginning, but that's fine. Can folks hear me?
We can hear you. Let me just. So while you get situated, Paul, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. So Paul Etkind is a retired applied public health epidemiologist who concentrated primarily on infectious diseases. He worked at the local, state, and national levels and was and continues to be active in professional organizations. Besides continuing work in epidemiology, he is active with teaching in Osher at Dartmouth College and Adventures in Learning at Colby-Sawyer College, governance within the Eastman Homeowners Association in New Hampshire, and the Upper Valley Jewish community in Hanover, the Sherlock Holmes Club of the Upper Valley, and writing letters to the editor of the Valley News and other publications. His academic background includes a bachelor's degree in biology from Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and a master's and doctoral degree from the School of Public Health at Yale University. So with that, Paul, I will turn it over to you. And
Okay, I take it to slideshow.
yep, slideshow. And then from the beginning, all the way on the,
Oh, yeah.
yep, right there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this invitation, and it's a delight to see so many familiar faces with whom I've spent wonderful time with on this journey. So I want to talk about pseudoscience, disinformation and misinformation, take a look at the history, and some thoughts going forward. A few of the goals are explain what each of these are and how they differ, just talk about some of the history of these activities, and explain the impact that these can have and have had on society. Start out with a quote: every man has a right to his own opinion, but no man has a right to be wrong in his facts. This is usually attributed to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, but an earlier version of this was from Bernard Baruch sometime in the 1950s. So why are we talking about this? You know what? There we go. All right. So let's see. Um, so I should go back. I'm sorry. Okay. Why are we talking about this? Pseudoscience, disinformation, misinformation are part of the human condition. However, communication technology has seen extraordinary advances and changes, particularly in the recent decades. So the potential impact of these activities can now be extraordinary, particularly having an impact on matters of social cohesion as well as governance. So we'll start with some descriptions and some definitions. Pseudoscience is a collection of beliefs and practices mistakenly regarded as being based in the scientific method. Examples, and this is a very incomplete list: human eugenics, astrology, alchemy, phrenology, and frankly, some dietary practices and guidelines. We tend to have assertions, or we tend to accept assertions, however dubious, if we agree with them. We also tend to reject well-supported assertions if we don't want them to be true. Uh, there are often, if you have a hunch or intuition, there's no data to support why you believe what you believe. And there's no systematic approach to studying this question, whatever the question might be. So, what is science? It is a systematic study of the structure and behavior of the world, physical, natural, social. We do this through observation, experimentation, and testing of theories against the evidence obtained. And the big difference here is that pseudoscience lacks the rigor of science. So, how pervasive is pseudoscience? So, in a 2016 survey of the American public, 43% said the government is hiding information about extraterrestrial visits. One quarter said the government is hiding information about lunar landings. Almost half said haunted houses exist. Almost 1 out of 5 believe that we can bend or move solid objects with our brain waves. And I'm not quite sure what brain waves are actually what they are. 1 out of 7 say that astrologers and psychics can foretell the future. And 1 out of 7 also say that Bigfoot is real. In the 2023 Kaiser Family Foundation survey relating to COVID, a representative group of 2,000 adults said 1 out of 3 said the COVID vaccine caused thousands of deaths. 1 out of 4, ivermectin was ineffective COVID therapy. And 1 out of 4 also said COVID vaccines cause infertility. Other examples of mis and disinformation, 2024 survey of the Edinburgh Public Policy Center relating to milk. 9% said that unpasteurized milk is safer than pasteurized milk. 15% said it's just as safe. 30% were not sure. So you put it together, 1/4 of the American public believe that unpasteurized and pasteurized milk were basically as safe, or unpasteurized is a little safer. Add that 30%, and now almost a little over half of the American public feels that there's something to unpasteurized milk that is positive. In another survey in 2019, run by Statista, a survey company, 13% of adults between the ages of 30 and 49 said that they believe vaccines cause autism. So we're all susceptible to questionable claims. We all have biases. We don't always recognize our own biases. The rigors of the process of science is ultimately our best protection against our own propensities for being irrational. Pseudoscience is characterized by some warning signs. There's absence of self-correction. There's always prospectively protecting against refutation. Users use scientific sounding, but really it's empty language. There are assertions that are based on anecdotes and testimonies, and there's no peer review of any pseudoscience. So misinformation is information that's false, inaccurate, or misleading. It may or may not be a deliberate intent to mislead. Disinformation is a deliberate attempt to mislead. You can manipulate the narrative, or you can manipulate facts, and propaganda is a form of disinformation. Cheap fakes, going back to the 90s, using photoshopping. You can do misleading editing or change the camera angles so the content can be interpreted in a false fashion. Deep fakes is the 21st century child to photoshopping. Deepfakes use a form of artificial intelligence called deep learning to create accounts or images of fake events, hence the name. So let's go back. Apollo 11, July 1969. We sent 2 men to land on the moon. What if they had been unable to get off of the moon? Were we prepared for that? So President Nixon had to be ready. I'll show a couple of snips. And
So, Paul, sorry to interrupt. I'm not seeing a video on the screen.
no, okay, I'm not sure if I can turn this off. So I'm being blocked by the audio. No, so is there a way to get rid of the bar?
The-
There we go. Okay. Sorry for that. Um, so you were not able to see President Nixon?
No, but let me, since I have a copy of your presentation, let me grab the video and drop the link in the chat for people to look at.
Okay. Basically, well, all right. The big news is that was a deep fake, and uh, no speech to mourn for the loss of those two astronauts was ever done, was ever prepared, uh, was ever practiced by President Nixon. Okay, so why don't we go on? So examples of misinformation. Um, the advice to swallow bleach to internally cleanse your body of the COVID virus. Ivermectin is effective as a treatment for COVID. There's no scientific claim, there's no science behind this claim, no clinical or lab studies that supported this. In fact, there's data showed that there were some dangers of this for some patients. It created great profits for physicians who set up telehealth advice services and also to MDs who wrote prescriptions without seeing patients. Uh, it also helped to increase distrust of clinical and regulatory authorities. The, the defense by these practitioners who did this, the evidence was blocked from the public, or ongoing research had been impaired or prevented. So nobody seemed to ask the question about, well, what evidence are you talking about? Who were these researchers? What institutions did they work on? And how is it that you know the evidence is blocked? Nobody else seems to know that. So propaganda is a staple of warfare. It's directing misleading information to the enemy about the enemy, or perhaps creating divisions within the enemy. Three examples: Operation Mincemeat, where British intelligence successfully convinced the Germans that the Allied invasion of Southern Europe was going through Greece rather than through Sicily. A completely fake army under the command of George Patton was created in England. If it had been captured on film by German flights, uh, they would have seen a vast number of tanks, artillery, uh, uh, barracks, etc. And they were watching that because they were sure that Patton, who they thought was the finest field general in the Allied forces, would be the one to lead an invasion of Europe. So if they could watch this, and when they saw that this was being broken up, the camp was being broken up, they would realize that the invasion was about to start. And they never realized that this was just basically cardboard and lumber. Operation Infection was a campaign prepared for by the Soviet Union. In the 70s, early 70s, the US and the Soviet Union signed a treaty they agreed not to pursue biowarfare research or biowarfare weapon preparations. Uh, After the Soviet Union fell, we learned that the Soviet Union ignored the treaty and they continued with their research. Um, and as a defense against possibly being found out that they had continued their research, they had prepared a whole program to explain that or to charge that the human immunodeficiency virus had been actually created at Fort Detrick in the American bioweapon laboratory, and that the Soviet Union was just trying to protect itself because the Americans were proceeding with bioweapons, so they had to do it as well. Other examples of disinformation: the big lie. Climate change is part of natural cycles, not due to human action, and there are medical benefits to smoking. Finally, COVID vaccine, not COVID disease, is what really killed people. So now I'd like to talk about the tobacco strategy. This is a strategy that, as I'll explain, Big Tobacco developed over time to try to dissuade people from believing that there was a link between tobacco and cancer. And this strategy has since been used repeatedly to mislead the world in a number of different political and scientific debates. So let's start out. So this was typical advertising. Goes back of tobacco, goes back to 1949. Viceroy's filter the smoke. Well, if there's no problem with tobacco and smoking, what's a filter needed for? Um, Ads claimed all kinds of health benefits for smoking. Smoking reduced asthma. It improved breathing. It improved your breath. You feel better if you smoke. Smoking diminishes your coughing. Smoking diminishes fever, and it blunts influenza. Scientific research, often in large-scale studies, were often referred to in these advertisements, but rarely, if ever, cited with specifics. And we'll see a few of those. The first findings of links between cancer and smoking came in the 1930s, but it was from Germany. And the rest of the world ignored the findings because the Nazis were not the most believable of people. But the Nazi government ran well-funded anti-smoking campaigns, and Hitler forbade smoking in his presence. In 1950, British researchers published a link between tobacco and lung cancer. In 1953, American researchers published a similar link. This was big news in the US. It was covered by the major media outlets as well as the smaller ones, New York Times, Life magazine, and so on. The Reader's Digest had an article that was titled Cancer by the Carton. This scared the bejeebers out of tobacco executives everywhere. They realized how frightening this title could be. I want to introduce you to John Hill. John Hill was the president of America's largest and most successful public relations firm, Hill and Knowlton. On December 15th, 1953, the leaders of America's 6 largest tobacco companies met with Mr. Hill. They were terrified by the possibility of cancer by the carton taking on as a slogan. Hill proposed, and all agreed, to cooperate on a multi-pronged PR and political campaign, where he emphasized that this was going to be a long game. And over time, this developed into what has come to be known as the tobacco strategy. The mission of the tobacco strategy is 2 words: sell doubt. It has 8 strategies, not necessarily mutually exclusive. Number 1, go hard on advertising, promotion, and sponsorship. In 2019, the largest tobacco companies, spent $8.2 billion on advertising in the US alone. Pro-cigarette messages had to infer a science background. They were marketing to specific populations: young people, women, you may remember Virginia Slim's cigarettes, internet promotions, use of trusted and influential people. Ads have cited large research efforts like this one without giving any citations. 20,679 physicians say that Luckies are less irritating. There's nothing in there that tells you 20,679 out of how many, who did this survey, what questions did they ask, was this peer reviewed? No, you don't get that kind of information in these ads. The tobacco companies also have been sponsors of major sporting events, most recently, particularly car racing. The second strategy is establish front groups. These are organizations or coalitions that are created or funded by the tobacco industry while minimizing connections to the industry. So the first, the trial run, if you will, that John Hill set up was the Tobacco Industry Policy Information Committee. Well, there was no science in there. John Hill realized after a short bit that it really needs to emphasize research. So that morphed into the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. And then Hill realized, now we have to sever the organization from the tobacco industry. So the final iteration of this front group became the Tobacco Research Council. Different institutes were aligned with different agendas of the industry. You had deregulation of the industry, smokers' rights. In the 21st century, smoking has made or tobacco has made smoking a personal liberty issue. Quote unquote independent institutes issued reports that could be sent to vast audiences. The industry spent money on quote unquote education that government agencies and health nonprofits could not possibly hope to match. They had advertisements and information that cited statistics that had no attribution. They had op-eds in major newspapers, advertisements in popular magazines. They conducted popular opinion polls, first to find out where their messages needed to be strengthened, and second, PR professionals know that all you need to do is ask a question, and that instills a sense of doubt in the person being asked. And they also sent experts, quote unquote, around the nation for local lectures. The most notable pamphlet that was produced by Big Tobacco was, quote, a scientific perspective on the cigarette controversy. This was sent to almost 177,000 physicians, 15,000 to editors, columnists, reporters, and members of Congress. The document was filled with cherry-picked data or completely false data, and it focused on anomalous or unexplained details. Third strategy is manipulate the media. Newspapers, radio, and TV were receiving significant revenue from tobacco companies, and they were reluctant to bite the hand that fed them. You may recall in the early days of television, I don't recall, but I do know, the Lucky Strike Hour was one of the most popular of the earliest television programs. Tobacco used what's called the fairness doctrine initially, and then versions of it since. The fairness doctrine is a journalistic guideline developed in 1949 with the rise of television. Broadcast journalists were required to report on controversial issues in a balanced manner. The doctrine wasn't applied to print journalism, but it was nevertheless adopted by print because the public responded positively to this approach. And what can you do? I mean, how do you argue? Have a balanced approach to controversies. So when news of studies linking tobacco with cancer, the media felt compelled to air industry denials. And the message to the public on this issue was it's not settled. Therefore, doubt remains. Tobacco manufactured a debate. They convinced major media outlets it was responsible to have balance. You have to present both sides of the story. So industry and quote unquote independent representatives met with major media outlets or submitted columns to them. And they explained the industry's commitment to a fair, balanced approach where the science was still unsettled. There was a commitment to balanced presentation of all the facts and a commitment to long-range research to ensure the public was not needlessly frightened. This is like tobacco was acting like a saint. Problem with this is that equal time is not the way of science. Science isn't about opinion. It's about evidence. There's claims that can be tested through research. Again, hypotheses, experiments, observation, analyses, discussion, and then it's subjected to critical peer review. Tobacco never presented science. It always presented confusion and doubt. The 1969 memo written by a tobacco executive, doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. I find it very disturbing that although the science was actually settled in the late 1950s, tobacco strategy kept the issue in doubt in the public's mind for over 60 years. And it continues to do so with a charade on harm reduction, which I'll talk about soon, uh, the emphasis on personal liberty. Strategy 4, funding scientific research. Industry money sponsored quote unquote independent research and made universities dependent upon their support. The research was to counter evidence of harm. Tobacco money was second only to the federal government in funding research in medical schools, and they focused on tobacco and heart disease. They sponsored national professional conferences to highlight the research it had paid for, and then broadly publicized the presentations. And they certainly had political connections to get their messages to policymakers and to the public. So this is amazing. It's the same number, 20,679 physicians say Luckies are less irritating. Again, obviously a large survey, but no information about that survey. And you'll be glad to know that your throat, it also protects your throat against irritation and against cough. So number 5, it's to distort science and to basically distort scientists as well. If the science was solid, and it was, how could they do what they did? They took advantage of the nature of science. Science is a process. It's rare for one discovery to settle any argument. Arguments are settled by a preponderance of evidence. And that was the status of the evidence by the mid to late 1950s. Now, science involves many details. Sometimes some details remain unclear. For example, why do some smokers get lung cancer and others do not? How come some non-smokers get lung cancer? So deniers and the industry lived for these seeming inconsistencies. With each new study, the science changed a little bit because something new is now understood. But new understandings almost inevitably raised questions, and these questions were weaponized. The tobacco industry used changes to say, well, guys, even science is confused. It's changing its story. Hey, do you think it was lying to us before, or you think they're lying to us now? And what can be better than having prominent scientists contribute to this doubt? For example, Dr. Clarence Cook Little, geneticist, National Academy of Science member, former president of the University of Michigan. He's a eugenicist, which doesn't speak well, and believed that susceptibility to cancer was genetic in origin. No environmental hazards here. He was hired to be the head of the Tobacco Information Policy Committee, the TIPIC. He promoted the work of scientists whose work and views supported the industry. Dr. Wilhelm Huper was chief of the environmental cancer section of the National Cancer Institute. He believed there were many reasons for various cancers, and his work was promoted so much that U.S. News and World Report issued a major article saying cigarettes were gaining support from the new work at the National Cancer Institute. Many other prestigious scientists made themselves available, including some of the physicists from the Manhattan Project. Their names were so well known that that was enough for the public to trust them. And this is expert bias. You can be an expert in something, but expert bias confers upon you expertise in things that are outside your training and experience. Physicists like Fred Seitz, Fred Singer, Edward Teller, and Linus Pauling, not a physicist, were some of the scientists recruited in this effort. Many times the scientists had no background, no track record, no publications in tobacco, in chemistry, or in oncology, but they had name recognition. And with these names, they could attack the reputations of lesser known scientists. They filled the airwaves and the pages with counterclaims. They charged there was no sound scientific basis for talking about a link between tobacco and cancer. And they said these are sensational accusations from publicity-seeking scientists looking for grant money. So not only are they challenging the science and also diminishing the scientists who are doing the work, but they were diminishing their own profession of science itself, saying that basically science is all about nothing more than publicity seekers and people looking for grant funding. Strategy 6, political lobbying. Boy, deep pockets can really help with campaign costs, fact-finding travel. They offered revolving door employment in the industry after politicians retired or lost elections, or it offered positions in government for industry executives. It had deep reach into the federal government and decision makers. Tobacco backed it up with massive mailings of information, position papers, rebuttals to thousands of legislators at the state and federal levels, regulators, physicians, pharmacists, editorial boards, reporters, you name it. And the mission was accomplished. Many in government, medical professionals, and among the public bought what the industry was selling, and it continues to do so. They continue to doubt. This is somewhat recent. We have new technology that brings us battery-powered electronic nicotine delivery systems, also known as e-cigarettes. There's a liquid solution with nicotine that is aerosolized. It's delivered without tobacco being burned, which is where the carcinogens are formed. E-cigarettes are marketed as being healthier alternatives to smoking tobacco, and it's an aid to smoking cessation. Tobacco is now a champion of harm reduction, which has moved attention away from tobacco and cigarettes. But you know what I'm about to say. Vaping is simply a nicotine delivery system. It's another way to create nicotine addiction. It keeps the supply of addicted people flowing, and it attracts younger people to nicotine because of their multiple flavors. E-cigarettes are now a $20 billion a year business and provides positive PR for tobacco companies as trying to improve smokers' health. Finally, the last strategy, number 8, legal challenges. Through the 20th century, tobacco used stellar scientists as witnesses. These scientists were from premier educational institutions, from impressive private institutes. They seemed to have no ties to big tobacco. They seemed to be independent. Therefore, they had to be unbiased. Juries didn't know that their testimony was not evidence. And this ended in 2006, when tobacco finally lost its first case in the courts. And interestingly, it was on RICO charges, racketeer-influenced corrupt organizations. The tobacco industry had, quote, devised and executed a scheme to defraud consumers and potential consumers about the hazards of cigarettes they had known about since the 1950s. It was part of a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud, and the dagger to tobacco's hearts, notes of that very first meeting on December 15th, 1953. It only took half a century. Oops. More current legal challenges regard issues like graphic warning labels, packaging proposals, advertising limitations, anti-smoking advertisements, taxes on the products, age of legal sales. It goes on and on and on. Each case is drawn out as much as possible to delay possible judgments against the industry. So I'm going to skip the next few slides and talk more about the tobacco strategy. This is a political Swiss Army knife. It has been adapted to fight other political issues that have threatened either personal freedom and, or more importantly, threatened businesses with any kinds of regulations. Examples of this include acid rain, the Strategic Defense Initiative in the early 1980s, or Star Wars, which purported to overthrow the concept of mutually assured uh, uh, destruction if an exchange of nuclear weapons ever happened between the Western world and communism. Atmospheric degradation of the ozone hole over Antarctica. The industry that made chlorofluorocarbons, which were used in so many different types of products, uh, was pinned back by this controversy, and they responded in kind. Secondhand smoke, global warming and climate change, vaccines and vaccine mandates. And finally, with COVID, it was the battle between the community viewed public health versus personal freedom. Each of these controversies used the tobacco strategy of advertising, promotion, sponsorship, front groups, manipulating the media, sponsoring research, distorting science, discrediting scientists, lobbying, and responding to legal challenges. And the beat goes on. The food industry has battles all across its boundaries with high sugar content, high salt content, high fat content in our foods, highly processed foods that are introducing all kinds of foreign chemicals into our bodies. The alcohol, the liquor industry. We used to think that two glasses of wine a week, I think it was a week, was protective against heart disease. And now we know that it not only is two glasses not protective, but any alcohol can have a deleterious effect. Gas appliances, renewable energy versus big oil, plastic packaging and recycling. And the tobacco wars are continuing with vaping and with personal freedom. So the question is, what in the world was really going on here? So this is Milton Friedman. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist from the University of Chicago, probably the most influential voice of economics in the second half of the 20th century. Friedman postulated two major ideas. The first is that economic freedom is a precondition for political freedom. You cannot have freedom without capitalism. You cannot have capitalism without freedom. The market will always be able to correct itself, is his second postulate. According to this, any attempt of the government to regulate the market is an attack on capitalism, which therefore is an attack on freedom, which is an attack on our very way of life. It is science that is doing the attacking, or if it is science, then science is a threat to our way of life, especially if that science is being generated by government sources, such as the EPA, National Institutes of Health, CDC, NOAA, NASA, etc. And this has given rise to a very powerful movement across our nation called science denialism. And in conjunction with what we're seeing as the power of the internet versus the type of communication that happens within science, there's just no contest. Information over the internet is worldwide within minutes. Science, however, is a very deliberate process and is usually directed internally. We're talking most of the times we talk to other scientists and not to the public. And this is no contest with the current rules of the game. And the other question, who were these scientists who willingly participated in sham institutes, provided sham testimonies in court and in non-professional publications, and eviscerated the reputations of other scientists, as well as distort the profession of science itself? These were scientists who were crucial to beating the Nazis to nuclear power. These were scientists who were crucial to creating better weapons and weapons delivery systems to overcome the Soviets. These were scientists who were crucial to making and keeping the US the most powerful nation in the world through the 20th century. These scientists were rock stars of their day. And I mean this sincerely. They were true patriots who loved their country, but they interpreted social changes, increasingly liberal social changes, as being detrimental to the well-being and the strength of America. They saw détente as weakness. They thought that détente was a Soviet ploy to lure us into basically lowering our guard such that the Soviets could come in and destroy us. They saw efforts to solve industry-created problems such as smoking, acid rain, climate change, to try to affect these and moderate them through regulations rather than the market policing itself. This was a danger to American power and way of life. So, getting ready for a conclusion here, Michael Dowling, the CEO of Northwell Health, which is the largest provider of clinical care in the New York City area, has been quoted as saying, "Things move at the speed of trust." And trust is a huge challenge in our society, given that these issues of climate change, smoking, etc., we're challenging the well-being of very powerful financial and political interests. We are at this time undergoing constant and fast-paced innovation in our technologies, and artificial intelligence is the main headliner on this one. So given we have need for trainings in communication that have to keep pace with the technologies, and that's not happening. We have a need for the culture of science to promote greater engagement with society. We have a widespread misunderstanding of the nature of science and the scientific method. It's very difficult for many people to wrap their heads around a way of thinking that's based on constantly challenging and re-examining what we know, rather than accepting what we know as being immutable. And we have a need to incorporate a more widespread understanding of the scientific method in our general education. Finally, unfortunately, we continue to make mistakes. And given the internet, the power of the internet, a mistake made is almost instantaneously transmitted around the world, and we're constantly playing defense to other organizations' offense. A few good sources for what I have here. This was actually about 45 minutes of out of 10 hours of a course that I gave at Dartmouth Osher, and I'll be giving the same course this winter at Colby-Sawyer. But Merchants of Doubt, Jeff Dembicki, the Petroleum Papers, Gustav Speth, a very respected scientist, environmentalist, I'm sorry, and Peter Hotez, who I think many of you recognize that name. These are books by them. And with that, Amy, are there any questions?
Paul, thank you so much. This was really fascinating and, also disturbing, to see these intersections of politics and, human lives and money and how it all sort of gets entangled. So, with that, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop your question in the chat. I think we also have a small enough group where if you wanted to use the raise hand feature and unmute yourself, we could do that. So I'll keep an eye out for that. But Paul, I have one question for you. So, you mentioned,
Excuse me, Amy,
AI.
Should I stop sharing?
Sure, if you would like to, you're welcome to.
Okay.
In this age of social media and AI and just being constantly bombarded with what you think is facts, what recommendations do you have for the American public to help distill this information that they're seeing, especially with social media? What vetting tools would you recommend? Are there
It's
any?
well, there are, but there's a lot of sort of bigger picture things that we need to do, and I alluded to them. I think our public health education needs to be amended. People, regardless of what area you're going into, we need to train and practice our communication skills. Um, we need to keep pace with what's out there and what's going on, and how do we try to recognize falsehoods? There was a wonderful column put out by a lady, Caitlin Gentilina. It's called Your Local Epidemiologist, and she's a marvelous source for information. And I can send you, if you wish, a link to uh, things that you can do. But basically, there's like a basic sniff that there are 9 of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but things that are basic that each of us have. You know, is this really that? This is so strange. This is so different from what I would expect. Does it pass it? The COVID vaccine was killing hundreds of thousands of people. Well, we weren't hearing about overwhelmed morgues, and funeral processions with that number of people. Just basically, you just ask a question. Uh, Try to find a second source, and who do you think is legitimate in terms of the news that it captures? And there are search engines like Google or DuckDuckGo that you can plug it in. If you heard something that strikes you as being odd, plug it in and see what else is out there. So those were a few, but I'll be happy to send this. And I don't know if that's something that you can provide to the folks who are here and provide to people coming to the museum.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you could share that with us, that would be wonderful. We'll send a follow-up email, probably Saturday or early next week. So whenever you get that to us, we'd love to share it with our constituents. And hopefully, that's, I think, one of our goals as a museum, especially with our student groups, is getting them to learn how to ask questions. Observe things around you, take it all in, but then challenge it. Ask those questions. And I think the more that we can foster those critical thinking skills, the better we'll all be in the future.
And it really shouldn't matter who is making the statement, because that expert bias is very powerful.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of not questions, but just comments that I in the chat. Great work, Paul. We learned a lot. That was from Lisa and Jim. And Nora writes, great presentation. Thank you. Thought-provoking, very informative. Kathy Herson asks, excellent, Paul. Do we need to develop a war on disinformation?
Well, uh, that's going to be never ending. And I think what we have to do is build defenses, which is what we've been talking about. Get a more informed public, and frankly, a more informed professional and legislative corps. Uh, so in some of those instances where I talked about, like the Star Wars, etc., Reagan and his cabinet were just completely overwhelmed by seeing one of these scientists explaining things, and they took it as gospel.
Mhm.
So we need to build skepticism.
Definitely. Lewis, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you very much, Amy. And Paul, thank you. It's just so amazing to hear this story. I went to medical school in the 60s, and you couldn't go into the doctors or nurses. I didn't go into the nurses, but you couldn't go into either dressing room without just full of smoke from doctors and nurses. And I think if they knew at the time about addiction, I think that might have been one thing that would have helped people. And I don't know if that came out as early as just, it makes no sense to inhale smoke. I mean, that's pretty obvious, without even any science. But I wonder about the addiction part early on, or was it just related to cancer of the lung? Because we were taught in medical school, the cancer of the lung, that's just a male, it's a genetic male disease. And so that sort of explained it that way. And finally, just to mention, it was 2 glasses of red wine a day.
Oh,
for
a day, okay.
Yeah, two glasses a day, and potentially women might only have 1 glass, depending on weight. It was sort of a postscript to that, and try not to get addicted, by the way. But anyway, if you could get back to the addiction of nicotine as the basic problem, was that understood early on in the 50s as well?
I'm not sure. I think what got everybody's attention was the link with cancer. And there wasn't a whole lot of attention being paid to the addiction part, and so much of the early literature dealt with that disease and tobacco connection.
And then,
Yeah.
and then just it seems like science, especially epidemiology, has moved forward much more recently with randomized controlled trials. Was that kind of approach available, or was it just more observable facts?
I think in the 1964 Surgeon General's report, there were some sort of clinical trials, if you will. Yeah.
I mean, with, say, animal studies with
There were definitely animal studies. They had over 7,000 studies in that 1964. And you talked about physicians and their smoking. Half of the physicians who were asked to be on the panel to review all of this, to create the report, were smokers, and half of them quit smoking by the time the report came out. And yeah.
And I think maybe Al Maria or others could comment. I think the smoking rate now is well dependent on groups, but less than 20%, but a little bit higher in college level and some other groups, but less than 20 nationwide. Is that about right?
You asking Al?
Or if Al or Paul, if you have the
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And there's this whole thing, when I was a smoker as a medical student and resident and junior attending, I knew that it was associated with cancer, and I knew that it was addictive, and somehow that didn't make a difference. So it's not, people's behavior, as we well know, is complex, and but I'm glad I finally quit. How old I have been? I was 35 when I quit.
Mm.
But now smoking has gone down. But if you include vaping now, especially in the younger people, it's almost back to where it was in terms of nicotine use, whether you're talking about cigarettes or vaping. So that's a very worrisome counter trend.
The whole business of tobacco's claims about vaping being a harm reduction, what we're finding, enough time has passed where the evidence is accruing, and we're seeing that vapors start out vaping and eventually they go on to tobacco. Maybe not all, but a good portion. So tobacco is ensuring its future profits.
And nicotine is bad in and of itself, so
Mm.
it's a poison. It's literally an insecticide.
Right.
Any other questions? Oh, Kathy, do you have your hand raised?
I remember reading, unfortunately, that what you just presented, Paul, is so discouraging because now they're vaping. But I remember reading a while back, one of the things that tipped the public is their family members were dying of cancer.
Right.
So it wasn't until they personally experienced the ramifications. And I guess the question is, where's the tipping point? Is there one today? But you know, we have a wealth of people here that maybe we can just do our little part and help spread the word throughout society. We're thinking that, you know, like Outbreak, teach one high school student at a time, you know, how to analyze the information that they get. But what a challenge. Thank you though, Paul. It's well excellent, really.
And the secondhand smoking was a huge controversy in itself, and the tobacco companies realized that they for a while they went away from personal liberty or personal freedom because they were hit with the possibility of, well, that gives you the freedom to kill somebody else.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Great. Well, Paul, thank you again. This was really excellent. We will definitely stay in touch, and food for thought, definitely.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to have been asked. It's an honor to have been asked, and I really enjoyed not only the presentation, but preparing for this. So thank you all. It really meant a lot.
Thank you. And again, everyone who's in attendance tonight, thank you for joining us this evening. And I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't just happen to mention that if everyone could keep the museum in mind for their year-end giving, that would be wonderful, especially as we're wrapping up our 30 for 30 campaign in celebration of the 30th anniversary. It's silly, but every dollar really does count. And even if you can't donate monetarily, even if you can just stop by, say hello, share a post on social media, you know, every little bit helps us, every point of engagement. So thank you again for attending. We're going to move into the business meeting. So if you're on the board of directors, I will ask you to stay on the call. Otherwise, you're welcome to leave. Have a great holiday, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Take care, everybody.